My cousin stole my inheritance. Years later, I made him work for me without knowing it, until the truth came crashing down. I was 17 when my grandfather passed away. He was the one person in my family who truly believed in me, even when others thought I'd never amount to much. The night before his funeral, he took my hand and whispered that he had set aside something for me, a piece of land he always called our dream. He said it would help me build the life I wanted. When the will was read a week later, my cousin Daniel smirked as if he already knew something I didn't. And then the lawyer announced it. The land wasn't mine anymore. According to the documents, Daniel had inherited it. I remember my chest tightening, the room spinning. It made no sense. My grandfather had promised. My aunt patted my shoulder with fake sympathy, whispering that maybe it was for the best. Daniel leaned close and said, "Guess Grandpa thought I'd use it better than you." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. All I knew was that something had been stolen, and no one seemed to care. That night, I lay awake, replaying every word my grandfather had told me. Something was wrong. Either the will had been tampered with, or my family had conspired to keep me out. But what could I do? I was just a kid with no money, no power, and now no inheritance. I promised myself one thing. One day, I'd rise so high that Daniel wouldn't even see me coming. The years that followed weren't easy. I left my hometown as soon as I could, taking odd jobs to survive. I worked as a delivery driver, a janitor, even spent nights unloading trucks at warehouses. Every shift, every sore muscle reminded me of Daniel's smug, face the day he took what should have been mine. But I didn't let bitterness eat me alive. I used it. Every paycheck, no matter how small, I saved. I studied at night, taking online business courses with second-hand textbooks. I told myself that if I didn't have the inheritance to start with, I'd build my own from scratch. By my late 20s, I had scraped together enough to buy into a small construction company. At first, I was just a silent partner, but when the owner retired, I took over. I knew land, property, and development, the very thing Daniel had stolen from me. Irony had a way of circling back. 10 years passed in a blur of work and persistence. My company grew. We built homes, renovated commercial spaces, and eventually became a respected name in the industry. People started calling me Sir, something I still wasn't used to. And then one day, while reviewing applications for a new project, a familiar name caught my eye. Daniel. My cousin. The same man who stole my inheritance all those years ago. He was applying for a construction supervisor position. I leaned back in my chair, staring at his resume. Life had just handed me the perfect chance. When Daniel walked into the interview room, I almost didn't recognize him. The arrogant cousin I remembered was gone. He looked tired, older than his years, with worry lines etched into his face. His suit was cheap, his tie crooked. "Mr. Carter," he said nervously, holding out his hand. I shook it firmly, keeping my expression neutral. He didn't recognize me at all. I asked him about his experience, and he rambled about managing small teams on construction sites, about needing stability. He mentioned debts, how work had been scarce, and how this job could really turn things around for him. Every word was fuel to the fire that had burned in me since that day at the lawyer's office. But I kept my voice calm, professional. "We'll be in touch," I said, sliding his application into the pile. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Part of me wanted to throw his resume straight into the trash. Another part whispered that this was my chance, not just to reject him, but to let him work under me, unknowingly. To let him sweat and strain while I held all the power. The next morning, I called HR. "Hire Daniel," I instructed. My voice was steady, but my heart was racing. Start him on the Westfield project. When I hung up the phone, I allowed myself a small smile. After all these years, fate had delivered Daniel straight into my hands. Daniel's first day on the Westfield site was almost surreal. I watched from a distance as he walked the grounds with his new team, hard hat slightly too big, clipboard in hand. He had no idea whose company he was working for. To him, I was just Mr. Carter, the name on the paychecks. I kept our interactions limited at first. I'd show up for site inspections, ask him for progress updates, and then disappear. He always looked nervous around me, like he was desperate to impress. The once cocky cousin who had mocked me years ago now stammered every time he spoke in my presence. The more I learned, the more satisfying it became. His finances were a mess, Gambling debts, unpaid loans, even a repossessed car. He had burned bridges in other companies, and my firm was his last real chance. One afternoon, as we walked through a nearly finished row of houses, he sighed and muttered, "If only I still had that land, things would have been different." I stopped in my tracks. My chest tightened, but I kept my face blank. He didn't know he had just reminded me of the very reason I was here, standing above him. I let the silence hang before answering. "What's done is done. Focus on the job you have now." He nodded quickly, like a schoolboy being scolded, and hurried off. That night, I sat in my office with the lights low, replaying his words. If only I still had that land. It was confirmation of what I had always suspected. Daniel had stolen my inheritance. And now, he was trapped working for me, completely unaware of who I really was to him. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel grew comfortable in his role, too comfortable. He was still sloppy with details, still cutting corners whenever he thought no one was watching. But I was always watching. I'd quietly reassign projects he messed up, never letting him see how close he came to being fired. I wanted him to keep working, to keep sweating under my company's roof. Every payday, I imagined the sting he'd feel if he knew whose name was really on that check. One Friday evening, I decided to test him. I asked him to stay late and prepare a detailed report on supply shortages. He grumbled at first, but he stayed. Hours later, I walked past the office and saw him asleep at the desk, papers scattered everywhere. For a moment, I hesitated. There was something almost pitiful about him, the cousin who once strutted with stolen wealth, now reduced to begging for overtime hours. But then I remembered the smirk on his face that day at the lawyer's office. The way he whispered, "Guess Grandpa thought I'd use it better." That memory hardened me again. The next morning, he handed me the report, eyes bloodshot. "I hope this is good enough, Mr. Carter," he said, almost pleading. I skimmed through it and nodded. "Acceptable. Get some rest." His shoulders sagged in relief. He thanked me like I'd just saved him. Walking away, I realized something important. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control. For the first time, I held the power he once stole from me. And I wasn't ready to give it up anytime soon. The more Daniel worked for me, the more I learned about the life he had built with my inheritance. The land my grandfather meant for me, he had sold it years ago for quick cash. He blew most of it on gambling, flashy cars, and failed business schemes. What should have been a legacy became ashes in his hands. I made sure to assign him to the toughest projects. The ones that required long hours in the sun, dealing with demanding clients, chasing unreliable suppliers. He did it all, desperate to keep his paycheck. And every time he wiped the sweat from his brow, I felt a twisted satisfaction. One evening, during a company dinner, he sat across from me. He had loosened his tie, his eyes glazed from a couple of drinks. He leaned closer and said, "You know, Mr. Carter, you remind me of someone I used to know. My cousin. Ambitious guy. Always thought the world owed him something. I wonder what happened to him." I smiled faintly, swirling the wine in my glass. Maybe he learned the world doesn't owe anyone anything. Maybe he made his own way. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, that cousin of mine. He was too soft. Probably ended up nowhere." The words stung, but I kept my composure. I didn't flinch. He had no idea the man he was mocking was sitting right in front of him. And in that moment I knew, when the time was right, I'd show him exactly who I had become. Not long after that dinner, an opportunity practically fell into my lap. We won a contract for a luxury housing development, the kind of project that would make headlines. I decided Daniel would oversee one of the most challenging phases, coordinating the foundation work. He was thrilled at first, bragging to his coworkers about finally being trusted with something big. But within weeks, the pressure began to crush him. Deadlines slipped, suppliers complained, and clients grew impatient. I stayed silent, watching him squirm, only stepping in at the very last moment to save the project from collapse. Each time, Daniel would thank me profusely, calling me a fair and understanding boss. If only he knew. The irony was delicious. The man who had robbed me of my future was now depending on me to keep his present afloat. One late night, as we walked the site, he confessed something I hadn't expected. "You know, Mr. Carter," he said, voice low, "I've made mistakes. Burned bridges. Lost things I shouldn't have. Sometimes I wish I could go back and do it all differently." For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then, I remembered my grandfather's voice, promising me that land, our dream, and how Daniel's greed had destroyed it. So I simply nodded. We all live with our choices, Daniel. He sighed, staring out over the half-built houses. Yeah, I just hope it's not too late for me. He had no idea that it already was. By the time the luxury housing project was finished, Daniel looked like a shadow of himself. His hair was thinning, his clothes always wrinkled, and the arrogance that once defined him had completely vanished. He called me sir now, with the same tone he once reserved for mocking me as a kid. One afternoon, I invited him into my office. He sat nervously across from me, fiddling with his pen. I slid a folder across the desk, a performance review. His eyes widened when he saw the results. Average at best. Barely hanging on. I need people I can rely on, I said firmly. You've shown effort, but the mistakes, they're piling up. He swallowed hard. Please, Mr. Carter. This job, it's all I've got left. His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw him not as the cousin who stole from me, but as a desperate man clinging to survival. But I didn't soften. I leaned back in my chair and said, Then prove yourself. You'll get one more chance. The relief on his face was almost painful to watch. He thanked me over and over, promising he wouldn't let me down. He had no idea that I was the very person he had betrayed years ago, the one whose inheritance he had squandered. As he left my office, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass window. I wasn't the powerless teenager anymore. I was the one in control. And soon, Daniel would finally know it. The day I finally decided to tell him wasn't theatrical. I didn't trap him at a Christmas party or make a public spectacle. I called him into my office and closed the door. The city hummed outside the glass, oblivious to what was about to happen. Sit down, Daniel, I said. He sat like a man waiting for bad news, hands clasped, shoulders tight. For a second, I wanted to see panic, humiliation, something to match the years I'd spent replaying that smug smirk in my head. Instead, I found a tired, haunted man who looked smaller than I remembered. I slid a thin folder across the desk. Inside were faded photocopies, my grandfather's handwriting on a page that named me, not him, bank receipts showing what he'd gotten when he sold the land, correspondence from a lawyer that had inexplicably gone missing. I'd collected everything quietly over the months, pieces of a private theft I'd always suspected, but had never proved. He glanced at the top sheet, then looked up at me. What is this? He asked, voice small. You remember Grandpa's land? I said, the one he promised me. I didn't let him answer. He left me that land. Someone, changed the papers. You sold it. You spent the money. You lied. For a moment he swallowed and stared at the folder as if it were a crime scene. Then something I hadn't expected happened. His face folded. Not the arrogance I'd known, but genuine panic, and then a sliver of shame. He began. I didn't mean. It was complicated. We needed cash. I was desperate. I thought. He trailed off, words tumbling. Anger flared, hot and loud behind my ribs. You thought you could throw away a promise to Grandpa because you were desperate? I asked. You thought his word meant nothing? He flinched. I was young. I made mistakes. I gambled it away. I tried to start businesses that failed. I tried to fix it. I'm sorry. The apology sounded like a man reading a line he'd practiced alone for nights. I could have stood up, slapped him with a legal suit, humiliated him, called the family to watch him squirm. Every revenge fantasy I'd nursed since I was 17 rose like a tidal wave. But when I looked at him, really looked, I saw exhaustion and fear, not triumph. I saw the exact kind of ruin that had once frightened me into silence. What do you want me to do? He asked, voice cracking now. Tell me. Fire me. Make me pay. He was bargaining for punishment as if it would buy peace. I sat back and let the silence grow. You already are paying, I said quietly. You work every day under my name. You answer to me. You live with your choice. He bowed his head. Then, softer, I said what surprised both of us. I could ruin you, Daniel. I could make sure you never work in this town again. But destroying you won't bring that land back. It won't fix what my grandfather promised me, and it won't fix me. He looked up, bewildered. So what will you do? I'm giving you a choice, I said. You can resign quietly, and try to rebuild somewhere else. Or you can stay under probation and actually earn it, every penny, every title, every chance. But you will never speak to me like you once did. You will never pretend you didn't know." He swallowed. His lips trembled. "I'll stay," he whispered. "Please. I'll do anything." When he left my office that afternoon, he walked straighter than he had in months, but there was no relief in his steps, only the heavy weight of a man beginning to pay back a debt he could not measure. I watched him go, and felt something shift inside me, like a lock opening that I didn't even know was rusted shut. Still, I couldn't ignore how part of me wanted more. I wanted him to feel the full taste of what he'd taken. I wanted to see whether a broken man could be made humble enough to rebuild. The next weeks would test both of us. Would he actually change? Or would my mercy become the very thing that let him slip away again? I put him on a strict plan. Extra training, a mentor assigned, and clear KPIs on quality and timelines. I removed the soft cushions he'd always relied on. My safety net would be gone if he failed. Coworkers noticed he was quieter, more precise. Clients noted better communication. He sweated through it, apologized more than necessary, and started showing up earlier than anyone else. One rainy morning during a site walk, a contractor cursed when a substandard beam was discovered. Daniel didn't shrug it off this time. He stayed, coordinated the fix, negotiated discounts, and personally checked the replacement at midnight. He called me the next morning and said, "I stayed. I fixed it. I didn't run." "That's what you should have done a long time ago," I replied, and for the first time, I didn't hear irony in my voice. Rumors travel faster than progress reports. The family heard, of course, news of Daniel's job, his probation, even the whispered story that he'd been hired by the owner himself. My aunt called once, voice venomous under false concern. "We always thought you were too sensitive," she said. "Letting this go will ruin family." I didn't respond. Months passed. He repaid small debts with wages, paid back a lender I'd quietly negotiated with on his behalf, and even apologized publicly at a town meeting when a past contract had failed and affected local vendors. The apology was humble, genuine. People started listening differently. One evening, standing on the porch of the house we developed together, Daniel asked me to sit. He looked older, closer to the man my grandfather had seen, aged by regret, tempered by labor. "I never thought I deserve anything," he said. "But working for you, being made to prove myself, made me see what I threw away. I'm sorry, truly. I wish I could undo it." "I know," I said. "Sorry doesn't fix paper. You never had the right to change. But it's a start." He looked at me then, eyes searching for malice, and finding none. "Do you hate me?" he asked, as if the answer might lift some terrible weight off his chest. "I don't know if I hate you," I admitted. "Hate is loud. There's been quiet here for years. Maybe I spent too long tending it." I let a small, tired smile out, one that carried relief more than victory. "What I feel is done with wanting to be small because of what you did. I wanted power, so I wouldn't be helpless again. I wanted control so you couldn't look at me and think less of me. I have that now. But what I didn't realize was that having it and using it for revenge would leave me empty." He nodded, and for the first time our history felt like a chapter we could close rather than a wound we'd pick at forever. In the end, I didn't take everything back. Legal battles would have eaten years and dignity. The land was gone. The records proved it had been sold and held by others who had legitimate claims. There was a small settlement. I might have one, but I chose a different currency. Dignity, respect, and the quiet knowledge that I had built what I needed with my own hands. Daniel stayed on, but not as the man I'd originally hired out of pity. He became competent, then reliable. He visited my grandfather's grave once, awkward and apologetic, and laid down wildflowers that grew along the edge of the property he'd once sold. It wasn't compensation. It was repentance in a small human form. A year later, at a company ribbon cutting for the Westfield homes, I watched him hand keys to a young family with a steady smile. The family thanked him. He bowed his head. Afterward, he found me and simply said, "Thank you for the chance." I could have told him the truth then, that I had once been the boy my grandfather promised the land to, that the promise had been stolen, that I'd hired him because I could not let go of that smirk. I could have revealed the private ledger of my long-planned revenge. But honesty, when used as a weapon, turns people into trophies. So I kept my secret where it had been useful, and let the work speak for the rest. On the drive home that night, I realized the story I'd wanted most wasn't about making him suffer. It was about making myself whole. I'd wanted validation, and in the end I found something quieter. The knowledge that I could stand on my own, that my grandfather's faith in me had not been misplaced, even if the land had been. Daniel never asked to be forgiven again. He simply worked. He paid back what he could with sweat and time, and in doing so, he rebuilt a life that wasn't stolen from me, but remade in my presence. When I drive past the row of houses we finished, sometimes I slow down and imagine my grandfather smiling at a different kind of legacy, one built by hands that learned the value of keeping promises, and by a niece who learned that power without mercy was the kind of victory that fell hollow. I didn't get the land. I got something else, proof that promises can be honored in ways no verdict can measure. And that was enough.